Hi, I'm Leanpub from Leanpub, and in this episode of the Front Matter podcast, I'll be interviewing Phil Sturgeon. Based in Amsterdam, usually, Phil has worked as a freelancer, consultant, API lead, CTO for several API-centric technology startups, and he is co-founder of the environmental charity Protect Earth. You can follow him on Twitter at Phil Sturgeon and check out his website, philsturgeon.com. Along with Mike Bafulco, Phil is co-author of the Leanpub book, Surviving Other People's APIs. In the book, Phil and Mike take you through how you can build the best web mobile client-side application when the APIs you need to work with are poorly documented, struggle with sketchy performance, or generally make you feel like you're on a dangerous expedition into an ancient tomb. In this interview, we're going to talk about Phil's background and career, professional interests, his book about Protect Earth, and at the end, we'll talk a little bit about his latest experience writing a book, and which will hopefully be another bestseller. So thank you very much, Phil, for being on the Front Matter podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Len. It's great to be here.
Usually I start these interviews by talking to the guest about their origin story, but we don't need to do that with you because we did that way back when you first appeared on the podcast in 2016. You can find that online on Apple Podcasts and YouTube. We uploaded the audio there, and you can find it all over on all kinds of other places. And I still actually remember that interview. It was really fun. Yeah.
I'm glad you remember it. I completely forgot that I did that. I don't know what's wrong with my brain.
Yeah, no, there was a great line where you said Leanpub literally saved my life.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's why I remember it.
Yeah, okay. That's coming back to me now. But yeah, I think I was talking about working for a startup that was rapidly going bankrupt around me and taking my finances with it. Then that provided me with a lovely income at a pretty rough time. So yeah, absolutely.
Something about immigration status or something like that and New York and things like that. But so if you want to hear that dramatic story, find the old episode. We'll link to it in the description and all that kind of stuff. But so in that time, you've been up to a lot of things. To viewers, we'll have links maybe to where we start talking about the book in the end. But what I really wanted to talk to you about at the beginning was Protect Earth, the environmental charity that you have started in the meantime. It's interesting. One thing that when the pandemic started, a part of this podcast, we added a new segment where how has it been affecting you? And they're like, a lot of people were like, well, I wouldn't have written this book if I hadn't been trapped in my parents' basement in Italy where I was when it started. And there were things like I was on the last flight out of France when I was still allowed to visit my girlfriend in Poland. So thankfully we're together and, all kinds of interesting stories. But I want to hear I'm pretty sure the origin story of Protect Earth is related in some way to the onset of the pandemic and where you were at the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm wondering if you could just tell us how that amazing sort of organization came about.
Yeah, happy to. Comically, just because we were talking about visa dramas, there was a visa drama involved in this story as well. Okay. I'd gone back to the States and ended up working for another company. You may have heard of them, WeWork, and really hated it there. It was a huge inspiration for the book actually to jump around a little bit too much, but everything was constantly on fire and it gave me lots and lots to write about, which was fun for quite a long time. But eventually it became too much, and I took a flight out to the Canary Islands was the cheapest way to get out of America. And just kind of started cycling and didn't really want to stop. The burnout was real. Didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. So I just kind of started cycling around Europe all over the place. And all of 2019, I went from Spain to Albania and up to Sweden, and I got down to Morocco, just went everywhere. And everywhere I went, I noticed it was pretty trashed. All the things you hear about in the climate news and all the kind of the droughts and desertification of areas that used to be lush and forest fires and floods and just everything. I noticed that it was pretty bad out there. And especially when you're getting 45 degrees heat every day and trying to cycle 100 miles and do some freelance work, it all gets to you. And so I spent a lot of time kind of thinking about what could I do. And while I'd been cycling around, I was working with Ecology with an I, because they're a tech startup and you have to spell words wrong. I was fundraising, planting trees for them. And I had this profile where you could add some trees to it. And I was like, I'll cycle through this area that's, I'll wild camp in this area that's full of bears and wolves for 3 days straight if you get me to the next milestone on my tree planting. And then people would do it. And I was like, all right. And I did it. I'm alive, yay! But there were lots of these challenges like that, and it was really fun. And I got back to the UK, and I noticed it's even worse in the UK. We have the lowest forest cover and the worst kind of just the worst levels of nature, however you want to quantify it, in all of Europe. So I was kind of thinking, what the heck am I going to do? But right as I got off the ferry back to the UK, that was when kind of the lockdown stuff was coming. They were like, we might have to tell everyone to shelter in place. And I was like, I live on a bike. I've got a tent. What's going on? And I ended up in an Airbnb, which happened to be on this massive farm, 460 acres by UK standards is massive. And yeah, lockdown happened kind of in the week that I was there, and it ended up being like 3 or 4 months, which is awesome because every day I'm just wandering about this massive farm and checking out their 60-acre ancient woodland that's basically always been woodland. I'm like going wandering around with their dogs. I learned to hunt and fish, and I learned to forage mushrooms, and I had this like real connection with nature there, not just kind of visiting a place that I like, but like really being involved with it and seeing changes day to day and as the season changes. And it was just really cool, and I wanted to try and do more there. And my friends at Ecology wanted to start planting trees in the UK. This farm wanted trees, and they had told me how incredibly difficult it is, how like the paperwork, the bureaucracy, like knowing where to start, like finding the guy that knows how it works to tell you whether you have a chance for applying for the grant or not costs you like £200 an hour to get his advice. So yeah, it's all just awful for people that want to actually do some reforestation or any other sort of rewilding work. And I figured, hey, I'm a mediocre white dude in tech. I can achieve anything if I put my mind to it. And we realized how incredibly hard it actually is. So we decided to start a charity that aims to help farmers who are already, and any landowners who are already incredibly busy trying to feed the country and run their business and do whatever it is they're doing in their day life. We're trying to help them, get past all the nonsense, plant a bunch of trees, help with the management, help with the funding, help with the ecological advice, help with everything. And we went from that one farm in lockdown to we're on 70 different sites now, 70 different farms. We've got, we're planting like hotels, motorway verges, parks, schools, council land. We're subcontracting for other companies. We're doing loads of things. And we've even managed to get, we directly own 2 pieces of land that we manage ourselves. And we're trying to get a 3rd piece right now. So it's scaled up since COVID times, like scaled up far more than I could ever imagine it would have done.
Yeah, well, congratulations on your success. And I mean, I know the amount of hard work and the type of hard work that you sort of hinted at there that goes into it, and the learning curve. That's just an amazing accomplishment. And to give people just a little bit of a sense of, the different kinds of work that you're doing. I listened to a podcast interview that you did not too long ago when I was preparing for this, and there was, I forget what city it was. Was it like Bristol, where there was a small woodland in the middle of the city? Where it was, I believe it was like, so there's farms that maybe need like a sort of windbreak and things like that. There's ugly motorways that could use, trees on the verges and things like that. But there's also woodlands that are in the middle of cities, maybe, that even people there don't know about, but some people know about because it's a good way to dump your trash for free, and things like that. And so but then you have to find out who owns it. Is it, and I believe also part of your process is when like you can scrape the web to sort of find, new woodlands to protect and stuff like that. And it's like, the first question is, unfortunately, or why shouldn't we do this?
Yeah. Everyone will tell you that protecting existing woodland from deforestation, it should be what needs to be the highest priority, but doing it is incredibly hard. That specific site in the middle of Bristol, and then back to the general question, there was a site in the middle of Bristol. Bristol's a massive city. It's like the 4th largest city in the UK or something. I don't know. And land is incredibly expensive there. And people had been trying to develop this land on and off for ages. And people had, picked this, it's 5 acres. And if that's out in the countryside, that's absolutely nothing. That's like maybe, you could get it for as cheap as 50 grand. Or even less. And because it's in the middle of Bristol, it ended up going for like £245,000. And we managed to raise 240 towards it with a combination of crowdfunding, donations, grants, loans. But it was being sold in auction, and it went to someone else who does have plans to develop it. And plan A was we buy it nicely, and there are various other plan Bs that involve various levels of crime that I won't be involved with. But plan B was to put like a tree protection order on the woodland, so that if they try and develop it, they'll have a much harder time. So we managed to get that done. But basically, if you don't own the land, it's almost impossible to stop people doing horrendous things with it. And land is incredibly expensive. So buying up land, especially in or near towns and cities, is incredibly hard, because you can have an amazing woodland and someone might buy it with the intention of like turning it into housing in 30 years, 40 years. You know what I mean? And you don't need to rush out and buy it right now, because you might be stopping some lovely retired couple from having somewhere nice to go and walk their dog, and they'll like improve it over time. You have no idea. So you see these small woodlands come up for sale, and especially when they're smaller, they are quite expensive for what you get, and you might not actually be protecting anything. And the only way to fund those sort of purchases is by like making stories about what might happen if someone else got it, and then trying to like sell carbon credits on this hypothetical, which is really shady, and I don't like it. So generally, we're trying to buy land that is, degraded, that mostly even the farmers don't want, that's just really not useful for anything. It's all got terrible access. You could never get anywhere near it with a vehicle, which sucks for me because I live in a van. But we're getting the land that's really degraded and restoring that the best we can, instead of trying to guess at what might happen to something. But if there is a piece of land that's like this, this bad thing is known that it's going to happen, we can try and fix that in a few different ways, but we can't always fix it by buying it, because it's just not achievable.
Yeah, no, that's the difficulties and the sort of keeping the long term in mind and things like that. It's so interesting that like, a lot of people think, there's the environmental defenders trying to block the developers, but those developers might have 40-year timelines for what they're doing, and and as you said, you have to keep that in mind. There's so much I'm interested in talking to you about this. One thing, well, let's start with the regulatory environment. So my dad, for his career, worked in the environmental department of the province of Saskatchewan for the government. And he had this great story. He was in the generation that did the first environmental impact assessments and stuff like that. And one story he told me one time was that there was a, conservative government in Saskatchewan for a long time. And basically they were very pro cut down anything you can if you could get money from it. And also kind of reactionary in the sense that there's like people who they just want to prevent me from providing for my family or something like that. If they're saying, no, you can't cut down those trees. And of course, all of that's missing. That viewpoint, as satisfying or meaningful as it is for the individual person, it always leaves the big picture out, unfortunately. And they were trying to do some sort of protections for trees that were meant to be in the interests of logging as well. It was like, they probably wouldn't have used the term maybe at the time, but sustainable forestry, right? Which means just don't go willy-nilly. We need a system to it. We need to understand the science of how trees grow and ecosystems and stuff like that. And they couldn't do it. They couldn't get it through. And then one day he had a meeting, and it's like, yeah, we're doing what you want. And everyone was like, why? He said, Europe has passed new regulations about the kind of logs that they'll buy, and paper products and stuff like that they'll buy, and logging that needs to be done underneath it. That's my long way around of asking, has Brexit affected regulation around reforestation and stuff like that in the UK?
Honestly, I'm not entirely sure. There were the grants change so frequently, it's really hard to keep up and to work out what is attributed to what. There were some rules that I'm aware of, kind of less to do with forestry, but more to do with kind of farming practices, because so much of our land is farming. Like 76% of our land is farming and is agricultural. And there were some EU rules that were like, you need to cut your hedgerows down to a really aggressive level, and hedgerows are like a very British thing. We love our hedgerows. But yeah, there were some EU rules that were like, these need to be cut down really aggressively. And then, lots of people were happy when we lost that EU requirement because it's meant that the hedgerows can grow much bigger and sequester more carbon and help wildlife. But as for forestry, I couldn't tell you. We don't get into kind of timber product stuff. We're actually currently cutting. We're cutting down a bunch of like non-native conifer trees in one of our woodlands to restore it back to being like an old-timey temperate rainforest. And so some of the we need more timber. I think we need more timber. We all need more timber. We import 3/4 of it, but we're slowly transitioning this woodland away from being timber to being entirely about wildlife. So I'm kind of the opposite of the person you should ask, really.
Right.
When it comes to like the tree planting grants, I do know that the grants have never been better. We keep putting money up and up and up for reforestation, to the point where that kind of causes problems, because the idea is like, hey, the farmers that own the land, they can do a little bit less, produce a little bit less sheep and a little bit less beef, and they can produce a bit more timber, maybe, so we can kind of increase the forestry through our farms, and they still get an income and potentially even make more money. But then they complain it's not enough money, and they complain it's not enough money, so they put it up, and they complain it's not enough money, and then it gets put up to a point where London hedge fund bankers want to buy up loads of land and whack it full of trees, and then they all complain. Everyone complains about that. So it's a really difficult system over here with grants and money, and constantly changing the laws to the point where no one really knows what's going on.
Yeah, no, that's actually another sort of high level thing I wanted to talk to you about that's come up a couple of times, which is when you get into the sort of nonprofit world or trying to do various works, the government grant is there as this sort of hook. You hear about, there's government grants for this, there's government grants for that. But as you said, getting the grants is an art unto itself and an expensive one to pay other people for. There's the other side of it is that this is all in my opinion, the fact that getting a government grant is a unique skill means that the actual application, the people who are good at what the actual application of it is supposed to be, is actually orthogonal to whether or not someone gets the grant or not, right? So it's people who are very good at getting government grants might not be very good at whatever the thing is that the grant is meant to be for, is what I'm saying, which is sort of
absolutely. And the way that we generally describe it as well is that the organization, so England, Wales, Scotland, have different people that manage all this stuff, which makes it extra confusing. But we joke that in England and Wales, at least, it feels like the entire thing is being administered by like one very overworked person in the basement with an abacus. And some of this can be solved with tech. Like, I've got a technical background, and I talk to a lot of people in like tech, reforestation tech. It's a whole thing. And there are people doing really good things. My friends at the Leanpub.com, they help farmers. It's kind of like Google Earth, but for your farm or your land or whatever. And you can map out your fields, and you can put, I've got these crops and do all this stuff. But one of the things you can do is click like, this field, I'd like to make it woodland. Can you help me do that? And it can fill out a lot of the form for you because it knows where your land is, what it is, whether it's in a special sensitive area, all those things. So it's making it slightly easier to throw more applications into a system which is currently being administrated by that one very overworked man, which I wonder whether they helped or not. Like, there are multiple problems that need to be solved, but if we only solve kind of things getting into the funnel and we don't have enough funding or interest to fix the fact that the funnel is completely blocked, then we're not going to do anything particularly useful. And that's kind of why Protect Earth, with our partnership with Ecology and other funding partners, we skip it. We just don't bother. When land is small enough, like it has to be, 2 to 4 hectares or whatever, like several football pitches. It has to be quite big before you are forced to go through the government system. Until then, you can just do it yourself. So we get a bunch of farmers and whoever that are just like, well, I'm not really using that field. What can you do? And our ecologist goes, you should have a bunch of these trees, a bunch of those trees, leave that a bit alone. I see some skylarks over there. Let's do this. And we just do it. We just buy the trees from the local nursery, and we just do it without the government being involved, which is really powerful and really helpful. And we're getting a lot of projects done that would not exist otherwise because of the red tape nonsense.
Yeah, that's one thing when I was like researching for this interview and like learning about how we could people would often be surprised, like, oh, I'll show up, where are you? Oh, that's not too far away. We'll get some trees, show up. And then people are like, isn't there supposed to be some terrible process going on and all kinds of approval and stuff like that? And like, if you understand the rules well enough, you can actually find there are some things that you can do without the need to go through all the red tape. Just to share a sort of brief personal story, I mean, about how complex and specific these things can get. When I was trying to get government funding for a nonprofit that I co-founded years ago, we found about this government agency. It was a provincial government agency that was meant to sort of help people doing local projects and provide them with funding. And we got a meeting with them. We're kind of excited about that. And we sat down with the person, and it was just like, it was like, oh, here's all the things I've heard about come true. Like he couldn't, we sent him our PowerPoint like presentation as an attachment. And he was like, oh, I don't do email. Basically, I'll get my
floppy disk to this location. Yeah.
Well, he said it like he said he was too old. He was 47. And then so he's like, I'll go get my secretary to do it. And then he told us, like, he basically told us, like, this was in the arts world and we were going to be doing something quite radical. He was told they're going to lapidate you, which means stone you. The arts community is going to stone you because you're new. You just showed up. You haven't paid dues. So I got very, I didn't get like physically angry, but I got like rhetorically acerbic and cut the meeting short. And this is my point of my story is that then is all that sort of interesting detail. He goes, he was shocked. He was like, oh, no. This is the start of a process. And which he meant like a bunch of meetings for him to do. And it's just a sort of classic kind of like, there's lots of people like my dad, I would venture to say, in government who do really great things and work really hard. And there's that one person in the basement with the abacus somewhere. But it's just interesting how like specifically personal those kinds of interactions can get with people.
Yeah, it's constantly annoying. Like I could tell you 100 stories about just the most ridiculous things. Like to make it clear, like you absolutely need some sort of process to make sure that people aren't planting trees in peat bogs and wildflower meadows and planting them all over skylarks and wrecking the place just to try and chase carbon credits. Like I hate that narrative, and I hate the organizations that I know that do that. It's kind of why I started Protect Earth, to make sure that people are doing the right thing. But there needs to be some sort of improvement where, like, obviously this is the right thing. For example, like the Welsh government have a scoring system. They're like across the entire country, they've got like a 1 to 5 scoring of this should be woodland, this shouldn't be woodland. And it's, we make sure that we pick land that's really high on that score. And even then, after buying the land, they've made us miss 2 planting seasons. So a year and a half, we've been chasing them for a grant process that's meant to take 3 to 6 months. And even then, like the amount of times they've come back to us and just got like, you've said that you're qualified to do this certain thing, but you need to use the word certified. I'm like, that's the same thing. And they're like, we can see that you've written there's no overhead power lines here, and you sent us a screenshot of the mapping software that shows that there are no overhead power lines here, and you've sent photographs showing that there are no overhead power lines here. But can you contact the power company and make sure there are no overhead power lines here? And then the power company got back and they're like, yeah, no, there's no power lines. That's why that's why we publish the mapping data. So there's all these kind of clever people trying to add these kind of technical improvements of like, we'll publish this data, we'll publish that data, and then that should hopefully make it all easier. And then the one man with the abacus just goes, and nothing actually happens. So yeah, like the UK, in 2019, when I was looking at the latest numbers, thinking about what I wanted to do, we did 19% of our reforestation targets, which were already considered like not good enough, across I think the entire UK, but definitely England. Oh no, yeah, Scotland was doing like 80% of theirs, and England was doing 19% of ours, and Wales was doing, I don't know, 9. So we massively need to improve the speed at which this is being done. And whilst my little organization is not going to suddenly, triple the output, we are doing a massive amount of stuff with a very small number of people by figuring out which things to care about and figuring out which things to replace with tech and figuring out which things to get stuck into. So I'm hoping that we can just continue to like hockey stick growth until we're doing ridiculous numbers of trees. But so far we've got like 100,000 in our first 3.5 years, which I'm quite happy about. The first year was only the first year was like 4,000, and then we managed to speed up quite quickly from there. So
yeah, that's just fantastic. One thing we talked about this briefly before starting the interview, but I used to tree plant in Canada, and that's a very different kind of form of tree planting. It was basically like industrial tree planting. If you want to get depressed, take a flight over British Columbia. There are a lot of clear cuts and cut lines between them, where people are sort of getting their vehicles and stuff to the cut blocks, and like it's not a minor thing that you have to cut these kind of trees down in these, because they cut them in straight corridors, which mean wolves can suddenly get around where they didn't used to be able to. Becomes a kind of barrier for animals to move around and stuff like that. But so like it's so interesting. Like I became very disillusioned around the world of like credits and incentives back then, where there was just like a number of things, but one in particular was, and this was the kind of planting where typically, you would plant anywhere from 500 to 5,000 trees a day if you were really good. But you can get the impression that like if you're listening to this, like that's like you've got bags with little tiny trees in them, and you just have to put it in the ground, step on it, move on, step on it, move on, step on it, move on. And one day we got to this, it was a mine, like an active mine in the mountains, right straddling the provincial park border with Jasper National Park, if you've heard of that one.
No, been there.
And like it was like active, like there were explosions going off and stuff like that. And when we drove up, there was this mine manager who was like very happy to see us, right? Oh, a bunch of like hippies, young people show up. He's like, great, that's just a bit of a diversion. And what we were going to be getting paid $1 a tree, which was high for us. And they were what we call pop can plugs. So like the plugs were like quite big instead of quite skinny compared to the normal ones. And so $1 a tree. And he took us to the place we were planting, and it was just flat, barren, lifeless patch of land. And it was like, we all knew right away, no tree is going to grow there. They have no cover. Like there was no like slash or anything like that. Like it had just been cleared. And he said this with a big smile on his face. He's like, this land has been planted by people like you every year for the last 3 years. I think he said like, it's a tax write-off for us. So we don't care. They force us to do it, but we can get the tax write-off. Go plant as many trees as you can. Don't worry about QA on this site.
That's horrendous. Yeah.
And it was horrendous. And it was just this kind of like convergence of so many different forces. But like I can just, and this is, the importance of technology and having like satellites looking at what's actually happening in these sites, and more local investigation and stuff like that. And it was very depressing, but it just goes to show that like you might hear numbers about like, oh, the government is giving tax write-offs to logging companies to pay people to replant them, and this many trees, of the probably 200,000 trees I planted over 4 spring seasons, I bet like 100,000 more of yours are alive than mine were that I planted.
Right, I was gonna say, it's nuts. There's such a massive difference. Like the work of planting it is incredibly hard, and I massively respect planters that can work like that. It's nuts. I've seen them in action. It's very different for us. Like most of our work comes from sending a lot of emails. You know what I mean? Like we can. One of our biggest jobs in the first couple of years was like 4,000 trees. And so when you think about like on these Canadian forests where they're replanting a bunch of Sitka spruce or whatever, you can knock that out in minutes. But it was months and months and months of trying to get all the paperwork sorted out. And then that one was with government grants. So they're like demanding that they be in like this exact density, and to the point where the only way to get the maths right is to doing like rows and grids, of very neat rows of trees. And so we're out there like spray painting lines in and like getting out all the stakes and ready. And that was pretty depressing. And then it's like 3 days to plant it with a bunch of local volunteers who were really excited to be allowed into this farm they usually can't go into. So it's a very different kind of approach of like bringing people together, and more about, it's not even so much about the number of trees. Like for us, we're trying to move away from the metric of number of trees and more towards like area of land appropriately restored, with broken down to this is wildflower, this is woodland, this is restored woodland, and those different things. Because it's like good survival rates might be 80% of our trees live. That's what we're aiming for.
Yeah.
And if we have too many survive, then we have to cut some down anyway, because you have to thin them, and it's better to plant more and thin maybe a few, or you lose a few, than it is to like have just a field with a couple of trees dotted around in it if you're trying to make a woodland, right? So it's more about kind of figuring out the best way to make this land be what it wants to be on some sort of reasonable time frame, than it is about just kind of planting. And the amount of staff overhead that goes into it, like I used to have this thing against this charity, I bet half their money goes to staff or whatever, right? And I haven't been paid by the charity. I haven't received a penny in 3.5 years, but at some point I'll need to, because we're growing so much. Doing 60 hours for free seems pretty unreasonable. But but the rest of the staff, like, we're building it up. We've got a full-time ecologist. We've got people writing content so people can see what we're doing, and we've got a project manager hopefully starting soon. And more and more staff work is getting more and more important. And so that's one of the things I've changed my opinion about the most. Of like, yeah, you want to be paying people to do this stuff, otherwise they'll do a half-assed job.
I couldn't agree more. And like I shared the same journey myself, like before I got into the sort of nonprofit world. It's like, a lot of these, you hear about the proportion that actually the staff or management of the nonprofit are actually taking, and it's so high. So that's just, money wasted or something like that. And it's like, if you believe in the charity or nonprofit or what have you, like, that money means work is being done on behalf for the charity to achieve its goal, right? Like why is it? I mean, you want to have proper transparency and oversight, that's for sure. But, do you want your donation to mostly go to not the charity? Is that what you're saying? Would that be better? Most of the money I donated to this charity was then given to other organizations to do the work. Is that what you really want? What does that mean? The money's going somewhere. That's one of those things that, like, can really sort of change your mind around when you learn about those things. Another one is, you can often tell the difference between someone who's done something about a certain category themselves and people who've just been observers. And I've got a little joke that, like, let's say in your community, like, I'll pick a sort of Canadian example, there's an empty lot downtown and the kids are bored and have nothing to do. And you're like, what, let's build a basketball court and like a little community center. And you look into the rules and you get community meetings and you sort of like make a relationship with City Hall. 5 years later, you find donors. It's just really hard. There's ups and downs when you think it's going to completely collapse, and then it comes back to life. Yeah. After 5 years, you and the hundreds of people who helped you build it finally build it. And then day one, some guy's going to show up with his ice hockey equipment and go, "Where's the ice?" And they're like, "This is a basketball court." And they're like, "Well,
yeah,
why are you excluding me and my activity from this?" And I'm sure you've had
sounds about right.
Similar experiences where people are like blaming the day for not being the night. You know what I mean? And it can be
right.
Once you've been through it, you're kind of like, it doesn't mean that everybody's perfect, but like, it does mean that you have a different perspective on like how things actually get done in the world. And it's often, initiative that people take to achieve a specific thing, and it can't be all things for everybody. Anyway, the last thing just on this topic that I wanted to talk to you about was just climate change. Was cycling around, experiencing 45-degree heat, seeing, negative outcomes. We've got a huge wildfire up in Prince Rupert. Last summer was really bad here in British Columbia.
Yeah. Is there another evacuation happening right now? I saw something about
that. There were a few thousand people evacuated from Prince Rupert, I think, in the last couple of days. I guess, are you optimistic that we're going to, as a global community, be able to mitigate climate change? Is this something you think you see success of a certain sort in, or are we, are all our individual efforts going to have any difference if we can't get the right government elected? How about I ask you that?
Exactly. That's basically the problem. Like, the good news is we have every single solution that we need. All of the tech, it currently exists. Everything that we need to do, we could just choose to start doing it tomorrow, and it would save us money and make us money and make our lives better and easier and happier just from actually doing it, regardless of any sort of, think of the children. Like, you could say it as simply as that. Like, it would be much cheaper and easier to just bloody do it than it is to deal with all these kind of ever worsening scenarios. But the it purely comes down to the politicians we have in place. I mean, I see small rays of hope here and there. Like in Bristol, we just got it's now a green city. We got more greens than anyone else. And that's brilliant, but that's still local government. They can't shut down the North Sea oil and gas drilling, can they? So there are changes being made here and there, and you do need it at all levels. You need your local mayor and councillors to be implementing more bike lanes and getting rid of some street parking and helping, with the kind of modal shift away from transportation, which is one of the largest forms of emissions in most of the West, especially in Canada. I think you guys unfortunately have the most polluting vehicles of all. I saw that stat recently. It's like y'all just love your double wide pickup trucks too much. I'm sorry.
No, I could go on. That's one of my hobbies.
Yeah.
I'm currently, I'm going to name it. I'm in a place called Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, which is where I'm from.
Oh, yeah.
And I haven't been here in a long time. And it's just like coming back to the prairies, like I said, where I grew up. And it's just like they paved everything. It's just like paved road, paved sidewalk, paved parking lot. Like and there's little paths we didn't pave. Let's pave that now. And
you have to pay it. Otherwise you have to like get a guy to come out and cut the grass.
Yeah, exactly. And so like right now it's spring and they haven't swept the streets yet. So so in order to make it easier to drive these big vehicles around, they just throw dirt and gravel on the streets all winter long. So then there's piles. So people are like living in an asphalt, dead space with all this dirt on top of it. And then like people are like, let's widen the roads, so I can get more of these very loud, unnecessary vehicles. And like, I kind of do mean to knock on people for that. Like a lot of these things are completely unnecessary, damaging to, like the everywhere you go, you're literally in people's homes and bedrooms with the noise you make with that machine. And it's all using a single use fuel that, the incredible amount of work and effort that goes into making it, and then it's just poof, gone out your exhaust pipe, never to come back. And it's large. Anyway, I could go on, but yes, I agree with you that it's very bad for that.
But yeah, my point is like, we have everything that we need. There's no like, what if we can suddenly fix nuclear fusion? What if we need this magical? There's a lot of people selling you some snake oil, right? Like Hyperloop, absolute bollocks, don't need it. He only came up with that so he could literally derail the Californian highway, the Californian high-speed rail network, right? Like all of these people selling you some magical techno fix that will save the day. Like we don't need them. We have the current solutions. We have heat pumps. We have electric cars that are fine, actually. We have loads of these solutions that are just fine. We just need the people in power to stop taking bribes from the problem people. Like literally, in the UK, we've got like Labour MPs being bribed by British Gas to say that the heat pumps don't work. Like the people that say these climate solutions don't work are being paid by the people that want to sell you the fossil fuel version. So we just need to get people in power to understand that we see through their nonsense, or get different people in power. But either way, once that's happened, we can do it.
Yeah, personally, I can't stress enough how important voting for the right party is in this case. And like, there will be people who will tell you, doesn't matter, the parties are all the same, blah, blah. Not true. That doesn't mean that any particular party is pure either. But the infiltration, of the oil and gas industry into actual politics, you hear it all the time, but when you know what you're looking at, it's very, very sad and dark and depressing. There was something that happened here recently with the Electricity Grid Operator Society in Alberta, which is supposed to be third party and stuff. And they it's complicated, but I'll just skip it. Like they did a press event where like you could see the guy talking, like reading out his speech, and then he got to the point where he had to talk about, and what was at stake was gas powered electricity generation versus renewable generation. And he said, you could see him double take, and he's like, well, he'd read it anyway. We don't want Albertans to be in the cold and the dark. And literally that term, cold and the dark, if the Washington Post publishes an article about, we should switch to induction electric stoves versus gas stoves, there will be a bunch of paid commenters who are like, what if the power goes out? Do you want to be in the cold and the dark? Do you want to be in the cold?
Right.
And like little things like that are actually all around you all the time.
Yeah.
Doing it for money. And that's the part that, you know, is very bracing. But like politics are the way through. I totally agree. Yeah, well, thanks for talking about that. I really appreciate all that. Moving on to the next part of the interview, where we talk APIs, which have kind of come up a little bit. So Phil, for anyone watching who doesn't know, wrote a very best-selling Leanpub book called APIs You Won't Hate, which was very popular. And he and his co-author now have a book out, and it's now marked as 100% complete, called Surviving Other People's APIs. And so let me just ask, what was the reason you wrote this book, and who is it intended for?
Yeah. Basically, Build APIs You Won't Hate does exactly what it says on the tin, right? Like this is how you build APIs. Great. The problem is I feel like a lot of API developers, most API developers, or most developers that have been asked to make an API that wouldn't even call themselves an API developer, they just kind of make this thing and thrust it out into the world and go, there you go, figure it out. And whether they get around to writing some documentation or they don't, and whether they get around to, you know, extensive testing or they don't, whether they get around to building SDKs or whatever, it's often just kind of lumped there. And even if it works technically, and even if they have given you an Excel spreadsheet that acts as documentation, you can always kind of like figure your way through it. But there are some things that you might need to, there are some difficulties API consumers will face with any API, whether it's good or not. So the idea was to write a book for API consumers of how to kind of work with any API, not just Stripe. Like, people use Stripe as an example of a really good one. Great. If you're working with Stripe, you're going to have a good time. But how do you work with any API, even if it's a little bit crap, even if you have to do it all yourself, even if their SDK is broken, even if the docs are bad, even if it randomly crashes sometimes, right? And a lot of this experience came from working at WeWork, where there was like this one example is my favorite story, and there are many more. I'm considering making like a book about purely about the experiences there. But basically, there was a third-party API that would handle the key cards. Like, when you turn up to your new membership, they'll say, "Hi, Sarah, here's your key card. Welcome to WeWork." And it would go into some third-party system that just used to love crashing randomly. Like, if there was 3 servers, there was West Coast, East Coast, and Australia. And that as the company as WeWork grew to include like most of the world, that meant that it was West Coast, East Coast, and other. And so it was literally like all of Brazil and China and London, and everything was on other. And if Australia had a particularly busy morning, then there were people in Los Angeles that couldn't go to the bathroom because everything had crashed. And like the entire company would crash because everything required everything. And if anything went a little bit slow, there were no timeouts anywhere. So literally this one server has a bit of a wobble and your entire company has gone down. And all of a sudden there's like men in suits on the developer floor being like, what the hell's going on, right? Like, you don't want that. You don't want that situation. And it's because literally no one knew the term timeout. And this book will teach you about that. So yeah, literally anyone who talks to other APIs should read this book. But also, even if you're an API developer, like, read this book to get in the headspace of what consumers need, how they think, what they want, what problems they might face, and hopefully it will help initiate more conversations between the two parties. Because I'm trying to arm API consumers with more knowledge and more kind of confidence to speak on certain things with authority. Because if you're an iOS developer, you know loads of stuff that I don't know as an API developer. I can't tell you how to build your iOS app. But, you know, these clients kind of are trying to talk to this API, and this thing seems complicated, and they often don't know whether it's their fault or the API's fault. So this tries to set out, like, this is what it should do. This is, if it does this, that's really messed up. And maybe you should talk to the API team about doing this if you have contact with them. So it's kind of for everyone involved with APIs, really. But, you know, I think everyone can benefit from it.
Yeah, no, I would definitely say so. And I mean, of course, the book starts like the very beginning is like API is a kind of generic term in computer science, you know, and like battle hardened knowledge, about how to communicate about this, not just about what it is and where to start. Right. And it's like, so I guess just to begin with, if you could maybe explain a little bit to people maybe who don't know what an API is, or like they're, a junior developer and they're just learning like how to deal with this kind of thing in the real world. What is an API?
Yeah. Yes, I should have started a little bit before, but yeah, API can mean pretty much anything. Your smart kettle probably has some sort of hardware API, but everything, it's an application program interface. And it's basically just how different applications or different bits of distributed applications can talk to each other. So if you're scrolling Facebook on your phone, then it's pulling data from the Facebook API. And when you post a message, it's posting that to the Facebook API. When you click like log into Eventbrite with Google, it's using their APIs to talk to each other in the background. So yeah, it's just a way of kind of joining things up.
Which is that's such a great explanation. It's one of the things that makes it so complicated, right? So for example, like Leanpub has a little API. Well, why do we have that? Because a lot of our authors are programmers, and they're like, well, so for example, if you want to publish a new version of your book on Leanpub, currently you have to most people would like sign into Leanpub and click in the menu and go to the page in their author overview where it says publish a new version. And then they click a button with a UI, kind of interface on a web page, right? Other people like, why? That's a lot of fingers off keyboard mousing and kind of, going to why can't I just do it from the command line on my computer, right? And so our API lets you use some hocus pocus, and then you can just type a command into your computer instead of having to go do all that other stuff. But
yeah, perfect.
But yeah, no, which is great. But, then someone else says, well, why can't I get an API to tell me how many books were downloaded in the last day? Why can't I get a command that'll give me that? And then all of a sudden, you're in what you term in your book a clusterfuck after a while. Again, that's just internal to our own thing, and we're relatively small.
Yeah.
And so I can imagine with a company like WeWork with all kinds of stuff going on, there's all kinds of people who are like, and it's not book authors, it's like kind of a partner, might be like our programmers have asked us for an API, which means hook our systems together in a certain way to make their job easier. But all of a sudden you can end up with this just like chaos.
Absolutely. And it's when there are so many different types of chaos, but a huge part of it is, like coding for the happy path, where my application is going to go over the internet, which I assume is working, and make a request to their server, and I assume that their server is currently working and it's not slow and it's not run out of hard drive space and it's not like randomly freaking out, and I will get that data, which I assume is going to be JSON, and if there's HTML, it will just be very confused and break, and I will look through that JSON, assuming the names of all the objects, and if they're not there, then it'll be a 500 error and everything will break. And they just kind of like go on this one happy path of like literally fetch that data from there and do this with it. And then there's what if the internet goes down partway through? What if it takes too long? What if it's a different format? What if they've released a new version and turned that one off? Like, there's so many things you need to think about. And sometimes you're lucky. Sometimes there's an SDK that does all of that for you. And you're just like, get things done. And you're quite happy until they release a new version of their API and that SDK doesn't work anymore because the underlying thing it's talking to has gone or changed. And so most people don't know this stuff. The hardest part with API integration is that you get it working and then walk off. And like it works fine right now. And then weird things happen. Like even the most trustworthy APIs. We had some friends that used to manage this massive company selling billions of tickets all the time or whatever. And they noticed a bug and they tried to deploy a fix for the bug, but their deployment system goes through Slack and Slack was down. Ooh. And so they're like, hey, Slack, deploy the thing. And they can't because it's down. So like, do you have these critical paths in your system that are reliant on things you don't control? And do you have a backup for when that goes wrong? Is there something else you can do? Or does your entire company crash? And sometimes it's something as simple as in the user interface having something like circuit breakers, which basically says like, all the requests to this server are going to go through this piece of logic, which is a circuit breaker. It can be implemented in lots of different ways, but make all the requests through here. And if 5 of them fail in a row from various different, if 5 different users have problems with this in a certain time frame, just flip a switch and say that's dead. Don't sit there for 10, 20, 30 seconds waiting for it. Don't have everyone sending it retries and spamming it as soon as it comes back up so it crashes again. Just be like, hey, that thing's not working right now. And in your user interface, you can be like, we saw that you wanted to book a room, but the room booking server is down right now. Do you want to just email Frank and he can sort it out? Like, there's so many simple solutions that don't cost any money at all, really. But people just don't think about that stuff until it goes wrong. And then they usually patch the symptom, which is, why did that API go down? Shout at the API team. Okay, but no one's ever going to be up all the time. So sure, feel free to shout at the API team. But also, what can you do to protect your application when their API goes down next time?
Yeah, it's such a complex subject area, and your book is such a great sort of like starting from the foundation all the way up to sort of like, like I said, battle hardened kind of experiences and stuff like that. And so I recommend it to anybody who's in this world, even if you've been in it for a long time. Having a kind of shared language and a shared source like this book, for example, would actually really help the industry. In the last part of the interview, we talk about the person's experience writing a book and things like that. And so I guess my first question for you is, the book has a great title, and it has a great kind of theme, which is kind of, Raiders of the Lost Ark, kind of Lara Croft kind of thing. How did that just come to you at one point, that idea of having like setting up the idea of like surviving other people's APIs as a kind of adventure with all kinds of puzzles and traps and things like that?
Yeah, I can't remember exactly where it came from, but there were a few iterations. I've been trying to work out what to write for a while, because like, build APIs you won't hate was so simple. It's like, this is how you build an API, dude. Like, it's I don't know, build APIs. And yeah, like I was trying to come up with something that really conveyed the message in the same sort of way, the same sort of jovial way. Like, there's a lot of people that have written about APIs and it's often very terse and academic and very complicated, and like, there are some people that need that and want that, and they'll read mine and say that's not enough. But I think that's a much smaller group of people, honestly, than the average person that just like wants to like learn some stuff. And you can't do that by just being really complicated and boring, especially when the topic is a little bit boring, to be honest. Like, APIs, quite a boring topic. So I tried to make build APIs you won't hate be as fun as possible. And someone said, like, reading your book is like having a chat at a pub with someone that happens to know a lot about APIs. And I was like, perfect. That's what I wanted. So I'm trying to do the same thing with surviving other people's APIs and whatever. I'm 10 years older, so I'm probably just a bit more boring now. Who knows? But yeah, like, it was an attempt at that. And I think it's a bit of a running joke in the API community that you're, just like trying to decipher what some previous generations of API designer may have meant by interpreting some runes, and sometimes you interpret them wrong and 3 different people interpret them slightly differently, and then things aren't compatible. So no, it's a really great approach. Like you said, take something that's sort of like a sort of inherently kind of dull and procedural and kind of make it interesting. And also, but I think it's like, I really loved it. As soon as I saw the cover image, I was like, like that idea of traps is just so compelling as a kind of metaphor or a fact, I guess. And you co-authored this book, I gather. How did that process? Some people are always very curious about, like, had you never met each other? Did you work side by side? Were you in different time zones? Yeah, me and Mike have still never met each other. It's nuts. Okay. We've known each other so he's APIs You Won't Hate kind of went from being the website for the one book to being like a whole online community. There's now like 3,000, 4,000 people in our Slack channel. And we all just talk about all API stuff. It's not just loads of people going, hey, that's a great book, mate. That'll be a bit boring. But it's become a whole community, a whole blog. There's loads of stuff going on. And he's the co-founder. He helps run that. This is an American company, and he's an American. And he is also the co-host on our podcast, and is fantastic. But he's got a very different background. He's worked in DevRel and is kind of mostly a front-end developer. So I really, building a book about API clients and consumers, you want to have someone with that background. And my position as I kind of often work as like lead architect or systems administration. So I kind of mostly hear the complaints from consumers coming into API team, and I try to like be the ambassador between them. But I'm still not I still feel more on the API side than I do on the client side. So the idea of Mike joining in was to bring some of that experience and to make sure I stayed in that voice, because I kept doing a chapter, and then halfway through I would jump into like, this is how you make a really good API. I'm like, no, damn it.
Right.
Mike would keep me on the track and be like, come on, sort your narrative out. I'm like, oh yeah, okay, cool. So yeah, he's been really helpful for that.
Yeah, that's just fantastic. The last question I always ask on the podcast, if the guest is a Leanpub author, is if there's one magical feature we could build for you, or if there's one thing that you're still shaking your fist, damn you, Leanpub, that really bothers you. Is there anything you can think of that you would ask us to build or fix?
I got really into ASCII doc. I'm sorry. Yeah, I quite like the ASCII doc, but I still quite. I was wondering whether I got like too complicated with it, and I'm like considering going back to Markdown and what's Markua?
Yeah.
Anyway, because I like the syntax of ASCII doc, but the kind of, but you have to like make your own build pipeline and like you tack together all these like Ruby gems and try and like produce all the different files, and then I upload those to Leanpub. So like, even if you didn't support ASCII doc firsthand, if there was like some sort of build pipeline that could work, that could be quite cool.
Okay, that's very interesting. I'll share that with the team. Yeah. So for anyone listening, so Leanpub has sort of more or less kind of two writing modes. One where you write in plain text in Leanpub in some way, whether it's on GitHub or Dropbox or in the browser and stuff like that. And then we have our own sort of markup syntax called Markua. That's like Markdown for books, basically. And then the other thing we added is like a bunch of people are like, I've got my own process. I've already got my ebook. Why would I, have to replicate blah, blah, blah. So we've got an upload writing mode, which is just sort of totally makes sense. And we get sort of awesomely formatted books like this. And what Phil's talking about is that sort of like really interesting sort of trade-off between like, basically how much work do I want to do on formatting and how much is it worth? But the other side of that is like, I mean, if you're a technically minded person, like you might find what other people are like, oh, all these annoying formatting tasks and build pipelines. And you're like, ooh, build pipeline, how do I get, it's sort of interesting. I've encountered many authors over the years who are like, you went and did what? I had someone who did some crazy thing with Microsoft Word once, and anyway, but yes, that's a very like good request, and I'll talk to the team about that. Well,
I was just going to say, that's like classic developer. It's like, I want to write a blog post. I better build my own CMS. Like,
exactly.
The whole point of Leanpub is that you can like make really beautiful, amazing books by just like writing some simple Markdown or some simple text. And I'm like, but what if I made it more complicated?
Yeah, exactly. Well, Phil, the book is surviving other people's APIs. The charity is Protect Earth. I definitely suggest people check it out at protect.earth. And I missed the podcast. What's the name of the podcast?
Oh, it's the APIs You Won't Hate podcast. So just apis-you-won't-hate.com, and you can join the Slack channel, and you can read the blog, and you can do all sorts of things. But the one thing I was going to mention, in case you weren't going to, is that you really kindly added Protect Earth as a cause on Leanpub. So if there's any authors listening to this who want to support a charity that they feel like they know a little bit, because we've just been talking about it for ages, then I would really appreciate your support.
Yeah, I'll put a link to that. So we have this kind of like somewhat obscure ability to sort of for charities to actually sign up for authors to share royalties with them. For anyone listening, to be clear, it's not a donation. You can't get a tax deduction. It's just sharing royalties from your book with them as though they were a co-author kind of thing. And we were really glad to add Protect Earth to that. I mean, that's obviously something dear to my heart personally. That kind of cause. So we'll put a link to the little Help Center article or something like that if you're interested in sharing some royalties with Protect Earth. So, Bill, thank you very much for taking some time out of your day, wherever you happen to be right now, to share.
I'm not even sure where I am right now, but it's been lovely to be on the podcast again, apparently. Thanks very much, Len.
Okay, thanks.